The night the Duke of Aldenmere was publicly humiliated, he was not even using his real name. That is the part nobody knew. That is the part that mattered. He stood in the corner of the Harcourt ballroom as Mr. Gideon Vane, no title, no crest, no consequence. And he watched a woman he had never met protect his brother from the cruelest thing London society does to the vulnerable. Not cruelty with teeth. Not cruelty with a raised voice. The quiet kind. The kind that wears a smile and calls itself manners and leaves no mark it can point to in the morning. James was 19, deaf since birth, and he was standing in the centre of the room with 3 young lords circling him the way dogs circle something that cannot run, asking him questions they knew he could not hear, and laughing at the silence that followed. Not loudly. That was the artistry of it. Just enough. Just the precise volume required to draw eyes without drawing censure. Gideon had seen it the moment it began. He was already moving. He was not fast enough. She was faster. He did not know her name. He did not know why she was standing near the orchestra instead of dancing. He did not know why a woman in a gown that belonged to 2 seasons ago, with no partner and no chaperone within 20 feet, would cross a crowded ballroom floor with the absolute composure of someone who had already decided what she was going to do and found the consequences irrelevant. He only knew what he saw. She stepped between James and the 3 lords as though she had simply misjudged the geography of the room. She turned to his brother and she raised her hands, and she began to speak to him in the only language James had ever truly owned, the one Gideon himself had spent years quietly discouraging, because the world was cruel and he had thought he was being practical. James's face did something Gideon had not seen it do in years. It opened, the 3 lords drifted away. People do when the cruelty stops being amusing. She did not watch them go. She was already signing something that made James press his hand to his mouth, laughing. Gideon stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the Harcourt ballroom, the most powerful man in the room, wearing a borrowed name, and he could not move. He did not know who she was. He did not know what she had just said to his brother. He did not know why she was at this ball alone, or what she was hiding, or why her hands had trembled. Just once, just slightly, before she stepped forward. But he knew one thing with the cold precision of a man who has navigated 2 decades of London's worst and best, and learned to read what rooms do not say. She had been afraid. She had been afraid, and she had crossed that floor anyway. And something in Gideon Aldenmere that had been sealed for a very long time. Sealed with practicality, with duty, with the weight of a dukedom he had inherited too young and carried too alone. Cracked quietly open, there in a ballroom where no one knew his name, and did not close again. He found out her name the way he found out most things that mattered, not by asking, but by listening to the people who assumed he was no one. Lady Isolde Vane, youngest daughter of the late Earl of Fenwick. The earldom had died with her father 2 years prior, swallowed by debts that London had known about long before the family did. She lived now at the sufferance of her cousin, Lord Harwick, in his townhouse on Grosvenor Street, which was a polite way of saying she lived there on no terms at all. She attended balls when Harwick required a female relation to fill a carriage. She danced when asked. She ate what was left after the household had eaten. And she did not complain, because women in her position did not complain, because there was no one in the world who was obligated to listen. This is what 2 footmen and 1 very indiscreet lady's companion communicated to the general atmosphere of the Harcourt ballroom over the course of the evening. Gideon collected it piece by piece, standing near enough to each conversation to hear, far enough to be ignored. He was good at being ignored. He had practiced it his whole life for precisely these occasions. What the footman and the lady's companion did not tell him, what no one in that ballroom could have told him, because no one in that ballroom knew, was why Lady Isolde Vane had learned to sign. Why a woman who could not afford a new gown carried in her hands a language that most of London had decided was beneath the dignity of polite society. Why she had crossed that floor with her hands trembling and her chin level, as though the trembling were a private matter and the chin were the public one. He wanted to know. That wanting was new. He was not, by nature or by habit, a man who wanted things he could not immediately acquire and categorize. The dukedom had trained that out of him at 19, when his father died and left him 4 estates, a seat in Lords, and a brother who could not hear, and no instructions for any of it. He watched her for the rest of the evening. She did not look at him once. James found him near midnight, near the door, and pressed a folded note into his hand the way he always did when the room had become too much, and words had to travel on paper instead of air. Gideon read it. Then he read it again. She told me about her sister. She has a sister no one knows about. She is not in London. I think she has been kept somewhere. I think she has been kept for a long time. Gideon folded the note. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked across the ballroom at Lady Isolde Vane, who was standing near the east window again, quite alone, watching the dancers with an expression he now recognized, because he had worn it himself for years at events exactly like this one. She was not watching the dancing. She was watching the exit. He did not approach her that night. The borrowed name felt suddenly like a very small cage. He found the sister in 4 days. Her name was Rowena. She was 23, 4 years older than Isolde, and she had been deaf since a fever in her childhood. The same fever, the same year, the same merciless arithmetic of illness that London visited on its poor and its unlucky with complete democratic impartiality. When their father died and the creditors arrived, Lord Harwick had agreed to take Isolde into his household on one condition, communicated through a solicitor in the dry language of men who consider themselves practical. The condition was that Rowena would not come with her. Harwick had a daughter of marriageable age. He had ambitions that required a house without complications. A deaf woman, untitled, penniless, with no prospects and no place in society's understanding of what a woman was supposed to be. She was, the solicitor had written, a liability that could not be accommodated. Isolde had been 19 years old. She had been given 3 days to decide. Rowena lived now in a cottage on the grounds of a small charitable estate in Wiltshire, funded by a trust that had been established by a woman Gideon had never heard of, and managed by a solicitor he could find no record of. The cottage was clean. Rowena was cared for. The arrangement was, by any material measure, adequate. It was the word adequate that sat in Gideon's chest for the rest of that day like a stone he could not dislodge. He told James by letter that evening. He sat at his desk for a long time before he wrote it, because there is a particular difficulty in delivering a piece of information to someone you love, when that information illuminates something shameful about the world you asked them to trust. James read the letter in the library. He did not sign anything for a long time. Then he looked up at his brother and signed 2 words that Gideon understood perfectly, because he had taught James this particular phrase at age 7. When James had come home from his first attempt at a formal dinner, and Gideon had found him sitting outside the house in the dark, refusing to come in. "It costs nothing," James signed. "To be kind. It costs nothing, and they still will not do it." Gideon had no answer. He was the most powerful man in this story, and he had no answer. And that was the night he stopped, pretending that his brother's life had been an acceptable compromise. He came to her as himself. He had considered doing otherwise. He had considered the borrowed name, the managed approach, the careful orchestration of encounter that his position made possible and his habits made instinctive. He had run through it in his mind the way he ran through any logistical problem. Entry point, objective, contingencies. Then he had remembered her hands trembling before she crossed the floor, and he had put the signet ring back on his finger, and he had gone to Lord Harwick's house on Grosvenor Street and sent in his card. The Duke of Aldenmere was not kept waiting. He was shown into a sitting room that had been hastily and insufficiently tidied, and he stood near the window and waited, and when the door opened, it was not Lord Harwick who entered first. It was Isolde. She saw him and she stopped. Not dramatically, not with any of the performance London deployed when it was surprised, just stopped. The way a person stops when the world has just rearranged itself into a shape they had not anticipated, and they need a single still moment to understand the new geometry. He watched her look at his hands, at the ring. He watched her understand. Then something happened to her face that he would think about for a very long time afterward. Not anger, not precisely betrayal. Something more controlled than both, and therefore more devastating. The expression of a woman who had been careful her entire adult life not to hope for things she could not afford, and who had allowed herself recently, without fully acknowledging it, to hope for one thing, and who was now recalibrating with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. He did not know how. "Lady Isolde," he said the thing he had decided to say, because he had learned at some cost that managed approaches were a form of cowardice dressed in strategy. "I owe you an apology, not for who I am, for the name I gave instead of it." She looked at him for a long time. "You were watching your brother," she said at last. "I understand why a man in your position would want to do that without the room watching him back." She said it without warmth and without coldness. She said it the way she said everything he was beginning to understand, with the precision of a woman who had learned to spend her words carefully because she had no other currency. Harwick arrived then, breathless and flushed, with the particular excitement of a man whose house has just become interesting, and the conversation became the thing it was required to become in front of him. Formal, brief, unrevealing, Gideon stated his purpose. He wished to discuss a matter of some benefit to Lord Harwick's household. Harwick agreed to dinner that Thursday with the enthusiasm of a man who had never in his life turned down proximity to a dukedom. Isolde did not agree to anything. She was not asked. That, too, sat in Gideon's chest like a stone. He told James about Rowena on a Tuesday morning, in the carriage, on the way to Wiltshire. He had not told him they were going to Wiltshire. He had told him they were going for air. James had looked at him with the steady, evaluating patience he had developed over 19 years of navigating a world that communicated without him, and signed, "You are a very poor liar for a duke." They arrived at the cottage in the early afternoon. Gideon stayed in the carriage. What happened inside that cottage was not his. He had understood this the moment he decided to come. That whatever was about to pass between a deaf woman who had been sent away and a younger sister who had sent her, with 2 years of letters and visits that Gideon had found no record of, because Isolde had hidden them from Harwick the way you hide anything precious from a man who has made clear he considers it a liability. That was not something he was entitled to witness. He sat in the carriage for 40 minutes. When James came out, his eyes were red. He climbed in and sat beside Gideon and did not sign for a long moment. Then, she knew. Isolde told her everything. She has known since the beginning. She told Rowena it was temporary. She has been trying to get her out for 2 years. Gideon said, "Out? The trust, the cottage. It is not a charity." James signed it slowly, the way he signed things when he needed Gideon to understand not just the words but the weight behind them. Harwick controls it. He set it up. He told Isolde it was generosity. It was not generosity. Rowena cannot leave without his consent. Isolde did not know that until 8 months ago. The carriage was very quiet. She has been trying to find a way to get Rowena free. James signed. That is why she comes to London. That is why she goes to balls she does not want to attend and speaks to people she does not respect. She is not looking for a husband. She has been looking for someone with enough power to make Harwick let go. Gideon looked at his hands, at the ring. He thought about the borrowed name, the managed approach, the careful, strategic distance he had kept from a woman who had been standing in a burning room for 2 years, looking for a door, and smiling at every ball because smiling was the only tool she had. He thought about James saying, "It costs nothing," and he thought about everything it had cost her, and he said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say in a carriage in Wiltshire on a Tuesday afternoon, when you have just discovered that the woman you cannot stop thinking about has been braver for longer than you have been paying attention. He did not go to Thursday's dinner. He sent a letter instead to Lord Harwick, written in the language dukes write to men who need reminding of the exact dimensions of their own smallness. It was not cruel. Cruelty requires effort, and Gideon had found over the years that precision was far more effective. He outlined in 4 paragraphs the legal irregularities in the trust Harwick had established. He noted the interest he had recently developed in certain of Harwick's financial obligations. He expressed in the final paragraph a hope that the matter of Miss Rowena Vane's independent residence could be settled to everyone's satisfaction before any of these interesting coincidences required further examination. Harwick's reply came the next morning. It was 3 sentences. It was sufficient. He sent a second letter to Isolde. It said only, "It is done. She may go where she chooses. I am sorry it took someone with a ring to accomplish what you had the right to demand without one." He did not sign it with his title. He signed it, Gideon. He did not hear back for 6 days. He told himself this was reasonable. She owed him nothing. He had done a thing that should have been done, and the doing of it was not a transaction, and he was not waiting. He was entirely waiting. She came on the 7th day. Not to his house. He was in the park, alone, without James, which was itself unusual enough that his secretary had remarked on it twice. And she came around the path near the east gate in a dark blue walking dress that was not 2 seasons old, and she stopped when she saw him. And this time she did not need a moment to recalibrate. "I owe you a conversation," she said. "I owe you one, and I have been avoiding it because conversations of this kind have a tendency to go places I find uncomfortable." "Then we will not go there," he said, "unless you decide to." She looked at him. The park was bright and cold and relatively empty, and the silence between them was the kind that had something living in it. "My sister is in Bath," she said. "She arrived yesterday. She is staying with a woman who was recommended to me by your brother, who apparently has been corresponding with me for 3 weeks without your knowledge, and who is, I should tell you, considerably more socially capable than you have been leading the world to believe." Something unlocked in Gideon's chest. "Yes," he said, "I know." She nodded once. Then she said, "Your brother wants to teach Rowena to draw. He says she has good hands for it." "He says that about everyone. He says it about very few people," she corrected. "I have been corresponding with him for 3 weeks. I know his habits." Gideon looked at this woman. Her steady eyes, her old dress now replaced, her hands quiet at her sides, those hands that had crossed a ballroom floor while they were trembling because someone needed her to, and she had decided that fear was a private matter. And he understood clearly and without drama that he had been circling the shape of this feeling since the night at the Harcourt ball and had only just found the word for it. Not admiration, not the particular gratitude of a man whose brother had been helped. Love, the inconvenient, restructuring kind. The kind that does not ask permission and does not care about logistics and sits in your chest like a stone until you stop trying to remove it and understand it was never going to leave. He did not say any of this. It was too early, and she had told him she was still deciding, and he had told her he could wait. And he intended to prove it with something more substantial than a speech in a park. He said, "Will you walk?" She said, "Yes." They were married 14 months later, in the chapel at Aldenmere, with James standing beside his brother and Rowena seated in the front row, not tucked away, not accommodated at the edge of the gathering, but in the front row, in a gown the color of winter roses, her hands moving in her lap in the particular way of a woman who is translating everything she sees into the language she loves. Because her sister had made sure she did not have to stop. The Duke of Aldenmere had attended 426 balls in his lifetime. He thought about this during the ceremony, not for any sentimental reason, but because he was a man who counted things, and he wanted to know exactly how many of them had mattered before the night. A woman in an old green gown crossed a ballroom floor with her hands trembling and changed the precise shape of every room he would ever stand in afterward. 412 that did not, 1 that did. He signed this to James during the reception, quietly, in the language he had spent 14 months learning properly. Not the bare grammar of instructions, not the management of a brother, but the full, living vocabulary of a man who had finally decided to speak. James read it. He pressed his hand briefly to his mouth, the way he had in the Harcourt ballroom the night this all began. Then he signed back, "Only took you 30 years." Isolde, standing nearby, caught the exchange. She looked at Gideon. He signed it to her too, because she had a right to know, and because keeping things from her, names, intentions, the true dimensions of what he felt, had always been, from the very beginning, the one mistake he could not afford to make twice. She read it. Her face did the thing it had been doing for 14 months, whenever he forgot to be a duke, and remembered to be Gideon. That small, unguarded opening, like a window in a room that had been sealed for too long. "Only took you 30 years, she said, and laughed, and the room for once laughed with her. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in the middle and didn't realize it until just now, then you already know what the next one will do to you. Subscribe and don't miss it. They come when you least expect them, and they always arrive like something you needed without knowing you were waiting.